wrong hands.
What is happening?
Open the door!
Please!
We've triggered containment!
About 7 years ago, the world changed in just a few weeks. Can't show you the real lesson in 30 seconds, but by the end of the video I promise you see COVID-19 differently. So the borders closed, airports emptied, churches shut their doors, schools fell silent, families were separated, entire economies stopped. Billions of people accepted restrictions that only months earlier would have seemed unimaginable. Not because they were conquered, because they believed there was a reason. For centuries, people have dismissed parts of biblical history and prophecy as impossible. Global events, worldwide disruption, restrictions affecting everyday life, international coordination. Then history reminded us of something remarkable. The impossible often looks impossible, right up until the moment it happens. Today, we're not asking whether COVID fulfilled biblical prophecy. We're asking a far more important question. What did COVID reveal about humanity that the Bible has been describing all along? Part 1. Why we name our crises. COVID-19 is simply an acronym created by the World Health Organization on February 11th, 2020. CO equals corona, VI equals virus, D equals disease, 19 equals 2019, the year the disease was first identified. So, it is not Certificate of Vaccination ID, Certification of Vaccination Identification, Coronavirus Vaccination Identification, or any of the other viral internet claims. Those are false. Human beings have always named disasters. The Black Death, the Spanish flu, the Great Fire, the Great Depression, the Cold War, COVID-19. Why? Because names organize memory. Psychologists have shown that labels help the brain categorize complex events. A name allows millions of separate experiences to become one shared historical memory. Notice something remarkable. The Bible does the same thing. The flood, the Exodus, Pentecost, Babylon, Armageddon. One word captures an entire generation's defining experience. COVID has now become one of those words. Future generations may never remember every lockdown, every law, every argument, but they will remember one name, COVID. History compresses complexity into names, and names shape how civilizations remember themselves. History remembers generations by the event that changed them. For one generation, it was the Great Depression. For another, Pearl Harbor. For another, the Second World War. For another, 9/11. For ours, it may simply become COVID. One word, one shared memory, one event that changed how billions of people viewed freedom, work, family, government, technology, and even one another. History rarely remembers every detail. It remembers the name. Part 2. The event that reorganized the world. Every generation experiences at least one event that permanently changes how it sees history. For previous generations, it was the Second World War. For others, it was the fall of the Berlin Wall. For another, it was the attacks of September 11th. For ours, it was COVID-19. The first reports emerged from Wuhan, China at the end of 2019. Within weeks, what appeared to be a local outbreak had become an international emergency. On January 30th, 2020, the World Health Organization declared a public health emergency of international concern. By 11th March 2020, COVID-19 was officially characterized as a pandemic. What followed was one of the fastest global reorganizations in modern history. Governments introduced emergency legislation. International travel slowed dramatically. Schools closed, businesses shut, public gatherings were restricted, healthcare systems rapidly reorganized. Millions began working from home almost overnight. None of this proves conspiracy, nor does it prove every decision was correct. that is not the purpose of this investigation. The remarkable fact is simply this: modern civilization demonstrated an extraordinary ability to reorganize itself at unprecedented speed. History had reminded humanity of something it often forgets. Normal life is far more fragile than it appears. Part 3. The plausibility moment. Here is where the investigation becomes fascinating. For generations, many people dismissed parts of biblical history because they seemed impossible. A flood affecting the known world, entire nations responding to the same crisis, restrictions influencing commerce and movement, messages reaching every nation. Readers often assume these belong to ancient imagination rather than historical possibility. Then COVID happened. Again, this video is not claiming COVID fulfilled those passages. It is making a much simpler observation. History has a habit of expanding our imagination. Before 2020, many people would have struggled to believe that almost every country on Earth could introduce extraordinary public health measures within months of one another. Today, no one finds that difficult to imagine. Before COVID, the question was, could something like that ever happen? After COVID, the question quietly changed. Under what circumstances could it happen again? That is one of history's greatest lessons. Modern events do not automatically fulfill ancient prophecy, but they can make ancient claims more historically plausible than previous generations ever thought possible. And perhaps that should make us more careful before dismissing history simply because it feels unfamiliar. And it also should remove the thoughts of dismissing claims the Bible makes about the future because it yet feels familiar. Part 4. What we should get right. People who have watched my other videos know I like to be fair, and every honest investigation must begin with fairness. COVID-19 was real. Millions of families lost loved ones. I myself can testify that my brother's friend lost his 2 parents to COVID-19. Healthcare workers faced extraordinary pressure. Hospitals in many regions operated under immense strain. Scientists worked with unprecedented urgency to understand a rapidly spreading virus. Governments faced decisions under enormous uncertainty. Some policies undoubtedly saved lives. Others remain heavily debated. Reasonable people continue disagreeing about lockdowns, school closures, mandates, economic support, and long-term consequences. This video is not attempting to settle every political argument. Instead, we ask a different question. What did this crisis reveal about humanity itself? Because crises rarely create human nature, they expose it. COVID revealed how quickly fear can reshape behavior, how rapidly societies can reorganize, how fragile trust can become, how deeply people long for certainty during uncertainty, and perhaps most importantly, how extraordinary events can permanently change what a generation believes is possible. That observation extends far beyond medicine. It reaches into history, psychology, politics, technology, and even theology. Because throughout Scripture, moments of crisis repeatedly reveal something hidden beneath ordinary life. Not merely what people believe, but what they ultimately trust. Part 5. The first thing COVID exposed wasn't a virus. Perhaps the first global casualty wasn't freedom, or the economy, or even public health. Perhaps it was certainty. Before 2020, many people believed civilization was remarkably stable. Supply chains were dependable. Supermarket shelves remained full. International travel felt routine. Healthcare systems appeared permanent. Economic growth seemed almost inevitable. Then a microscopic virus reminded the world that complexity is also vulnerability. Within weeks, shortages appeared. Flights stopped. Factories closed. Entire industries paused. The issue was never simply the virus, it was interdependence. Modern civilization is connected more deeply than any society in history, and that means disruption travels faster than ever before. One event, thousands of consequences. This is why historians increasingly describe our age as a globally interconnected system. Everything touches everything else. COVID exposed that hidden architecture, but perhaps it exposed something even deeper. Not merely how connected our economies are, but how connected humanity itself has become. And once again, history quietly made another biblical idea easier to imagine. A world where events no longer remain local. A world where one crisis can rapidly influence every nation. Not because the Bible needed COVID to become true, but because COVID reminded us how history actually behaves, sometimes far faster than anyone expects. Part 6. Fear reorganizes human behavior. History has always taught the same lesson. Fear changes people. Not because human beings suddenly become different, but because fear reveals priorities that comfort keeps hidden. Before COVID, most people assumed they understood how they would behave during a global crisis. Then, the crisis arrived. Parents feared for their children. Grandparents isolated themselves from family. Neighbors looked at neighbors differently. Strangers became potential threats. Entire streets fell silent. Psychologists have long understood this phenomenon. When uncertainty rises, the human brain instinctively shifts towards survival. The amygdala, the brain's threat detection system, becomes more active. Decision-making changes. People become more cautious, more risk-averse, more willing to accept restrictions if those restrictions appear to reduce danger. This is not weakness, it is human biology. Throughout history, governments, military leaders, and emergency planners have understood that fear changes public behavior far more rapidly than persuasion alone. COVID demonstrated this principle on a global scale. Not because fear was manufactured, but because fear itself possesses extraordinary social power. Once enough people perceive danger, society reorganizes itself. Perhaps this explains why Scripture so often repeats one command more than any other: fear not. Because fear has always possessed the power to reshape civilizations. Part 7. The second thing COVID exposed was trust. Perhaps the greatest invisible casualty of COVID was trust. Not trust in one government or one institution, trust itself. Before the pandemic, trust in many public institutions had already been declining across much of the Western world. COVID accelerated that trend. At first, many countries experienced what political scientists call the rally round the flag effect. During national emergencies, citizens often increased their trust in leaders, believing unity is essential. For a time, many governments saw public confidence rise. But as the pandemic continued, something changed. Scientific advice evolved, policies changed, rules differed between countries, public messaging shifted, political scandals emerged, economic hardship increased. Communities became divided over vaccines, lockdowns, masks, and mandates. By 2023, OECD research found that a significant proportion of people across surveyed nations reported low or no trust in national government. Whether one believes governments acted wisely or poorly, one fact is difficult to deny: trust became fractured. And when trust fractures, every institution begins struggling. Science, media, education, healthcare, politics, even families. Trust is one of civilization's invisible foundations. When it weakens, everything above it becomes unstable. The Bible repeatedly warns about this. Not merely because trust is emotionally comforting, but because healthy societies depend upon truth. Without truth, trust cannot survive. Part 8. Relationships were tested like never before. Perhaps the deepest wounds of COVID were not economic, they were relational. For many people, the pandemic became the first time they discovered that those closest to them could see the same event completely differently. Families argued, friendships ended, churches divided, neighbors judged one another. Some believed restrictions were acts of compassion. Others believed they represented unnecessary overreach. Most people were not acting from hatred, they were acting from sincerely different understandings of risk, responsibility, and freedom. Psychologists describe this as identity protective cognition. Once beliefs become connected to identity, contradictory evidence often strengthens existing positions rather than weakening them. People begin defending not merely opinions, but themselves. COVID became more than a medical event. It became a moral event. Questions such as, should I stay home? Should I visit my parents? Should children return to school? Quickly became questions about virtue. Suddenly, ordinary decisions carried moral weight. This revealed something profound. Human beings rarely divide first over facts. We divide over values. And values become most visible during crisis. Perhaps this explains why Jesus repeatedly taught that love is easiest during peace, but proven during pressure. Because crises expose relationships the way fire exposes metal, they reveal what was already there. Part 9. The infrastructure was built. Now the investigation reaches one of its most important discoveries. Every crisis leaves behind more than memories. It leaves infrastructure. During COVID, governments around the world developed systems at remarkable speed. Digital health certificates, QR code verification, remote working platforms, online education, contact tracing technology, large-scale emergency procurement systems, cross-border health coordination, public communication networks. Some of these innovations solved genuine problems. Many allowed societies to continue functioning under extraordinary circumstances. Others raised ongoing debates about privacy, proportionality, and long-term governance. The important observation is not whether every system was good or bad. It is that the systems now exist. History repeatedly shows that infrastructure created during one emergency often becomes available during the next. Railways built for war later transformed commerce. Radar developed during conflict reshaped aviation. The internet itself grew from defense research before changing everyday life. COVID demonstrated the same historical principle. Crises accelerate systems that might otherwise have taken decades to develop. That does not automatically mean those systems will be misused, but it does change what humanity is capable of. The impossible becomes operational. The unimaginable becomes ordinary. And once again, history quietly makes another biblical idea easier to imagine. Not because prophecy depends upon technology, but because technology changes what civilization can now accomplish. The law moved faster than people could think. Perhaps one of the most overlooked lessons of COVID was not medical, it was legal. When governments believe a nation faces an emergency, law can move with astonishing speed. In the United Kingdom, the Coronavirus Act 2020 passed through Parliament in just 4 sitting days before receiving royal assent on 25th March 2020. Across Europe, North America, Asia, and many other regions, emergency powers expanded rapidly as governments attempted to respond to an unfolding crisis. Some measures were temporary, others lasted much longer than originally expected. Many have since expired. Some emergency powers were repealed, others evolved into permanent preparedness frameworks, digital infrastructure, revised public health planning, or updated international coordination. History has seen this pattern before. Wars reshape governments. Financial crises reshape banking. Terrorist attacks reshape security legislation. Pandemics reshape public health systems. This does not automatically imply bad intentions. It reveals something much deeper. Crises accelerate history. They compress years of political change into months. And perhaps the greatest lesson is not that governments gained emergency powers. It is that entire populations accepted extraordinary legal change because the crisis appeared extraordinary. That observation reaches far beyond COVID. It reaches into the nature of human civilization itself. History's greatest lesson. History repeatedly teaches one uncomfortable truth. Human beings rarely surrender freedoms all at once. They surrender them one emergency at a time. The Roman Republic expanded emergency powers during periods of instability. The First World War transformed government administration across Europe. The Second World War reshaped economies, borders, and international institutions. The attacks of September 11th permanently changed aviation security, surveillance practices, and counter-terrorism policy in many countries. COVID became another chapter in that long historical pattern. Again, this is not an argument against emergency action. Emergencies require decisions. Lives must be protected. Governments have responsibilities. The lesson is different. Infrastructure built during crisis often survives long after the crisis itself. That is simply how history works. Bridges remain after wars. Technologies remain after conflicts. Institutions remain after emergencies. The trigger ends. The architecture remains. Perhaps this is one of history's oldest patterns. The event passes. The systems endure. Every crisis has 3 layers. Now the hidden architecture finally appears. Every major crisis in history follows a remarkably similar pattern. First, there is the source, the trigger, a virus, a war, an economic collapse, a natural disaster. Then comes the expression, the visible response, emergency laws, public messaging, behavioral change, technology, restrictions, economic intervention. This is the part history remembers. But there is a third layer most people never notice. Continuity, the habits that remain, the systems that remain, the infrastructure that remains, the psychology that remains, the expectations that remain. The world after the crisis is never quite the same as the world before it. Notice something extraordinary. This same architecture appears throughout reality. In biology, DNA, RNA, living expression. In communication, thought, word, understanding. In light, source, radiance, propagation. Throughout creation, we repeatedly encounter a pattern, source, expression, continuity, not because these things prove the Trinity, but because they reveal a recurring architecture woven throughout reality. Perhaps history itself follows the same design. COVID was the source. Global reorganization became the expression. The transformed world became the continuity. The crisis passed. The architecture remained. Why prophecy no longer feels impossible. For centuries, readers approached biblical prophecy with one objection. It could never happen. How could information reach every nation? How could global commerce become interconnected? How could governments respond together? How could buying and selling ever become conditional? How could one crisis influence the whole world? Modern history has changed those questions. The internet demonstrated global communication. Digital finance demonstrated interconnected commerce. Artificial intelligence is transforming information itself. COVID demonstrated rapid international coordination during crisis. Again, this documentary is not claiming these events fulfilled biblical prophecy. It is making a far more careful observation. History has made certain biblical scenarios easier to imagine than at any previous point in human history. The question has changed. Not, is it possible, but what conditions would make it possible? That is a profound historical shift. Perhaps skepticism should become a little more humble, because history repeatedly surprises those who confuse unprecedented with impossible. COVID didn't change humanity. Perhaps the greatest lesson of COVID was not what it changed, it was what it revealed. It revealed how deeply human beings long for certainty, how quickly fear reorganizes behavior, how fragile trust can become, how precious relationships truly are, how interconnected civilization has become, how rapidly infrastructure can be built, how quickly extraordinary events become ordinary. But above all, It reminded us that history is capable of turning faster than anyone expects. The Bible has always described history as moving toward moments when ordinary life changes suddenly. Not because God delights in fear, but because crisis exposes the foundations upon which civilizations have quietly been built. COVID was not the end of the story. It was a reminder, not of what will happen, but of what can happen. And perhaps that is why this generation should read history with greater humility than the last. 7 years later, the virus is no longer the biggest story. We are, because COVID revealed something humanity had almost forgotten. Civilizations are stronger than they appear, yet also more fragile than they imagine. Technology advances, laws evolve, infrastructure grows, but the human heart remains remarkably unchanged, still searching for certainty, still fearing uncertainty, still longing for hope. Perhaps that is why Jesus did not tell his followers to place their confidence in governments, or economies, or even history itself. He told them to build their lives upon a foundation that storms cannot remove, because every generation eventually discovers the same truth. The next crisis is never the greatest danger. The greatest danger is discovering too late that the foundations beneath our lives were never as permanent as we believed. And perhaps that is what COVID truly revealed. Not merely the vulnerability of our bodies, but the vulnerability of everything we once thought could never change.